Hi everyone! In this video we're going to be working on pages 7 and 8 from your book. So 7 and then we'll flip over to page 8. We are working on factoring. So factoring polynomials. Factoring is a really important topic, and if you can understand factoring polynomials, you'll be set in for future math classes whenever you see polynomials again, because they come up over and over and over again. So we're going to start with filling in the number of terms in each polynomial. So terms are separated by a plus or minus, but not multiplication, and I'll show you what I mean here. In the first polynomial, x squared plus 3x minus 5, there's 3 terms. Okay, they're separated by a plus here and a minus here. Expanded means that you've multiplied everything out, so this is already expanded. You don't really have to write it again. It's already in the expanded form, but you can if you'd like. And then the number of terms in the expanded version, it's the same. So expanded is precisely the same as what we started with on this one, so it's still 3 terms. The next polynomial, it's actually only 2 terms, and I know I said terms are separated by plus and minus. Well, yes, there's 2 terms within the parentheses here, but all of this is being multiplied, and then the whole polynomial has something multiplied here plus something multiplied here, so there's really only 2 terms here. This is 1 term, all of this getting multiplied, and then this is the second. And so if I expand this polynomial, I'm going to distribute. So this becomes 5x to the third when I times it by x. And then if I times it by the minus 5, this becomes negative 25x to the second, or x squared. And in the back here, distribute the 3. Plus 3x, and then 3 times negative 5 is negative 15. And so none of these terms can combine. There's no like x squareds here and somewhere else. So none of these combine, so there's 4 terms when we expand. Next one, 0.6 times x minus 5 plus 1. Initially there's only 2 terms. This whole term that's getting multiplied by 0.6, this is a term, and then the plus 1. So if I expand this, I'm going to distribute the 0.6. So this is 0.6 times x, and then 0.6 times negative 5. You can use a calculator if you need to, or just think about what's 6 times 5. First of all, it's going to be a negative number because of the negative 5. 6 times 5 is 30, but because it's 0.6, it's just going to give us 3. And then plus 1. And so this expanded polynomial, it looks like 3 terms now, but you can combine these two because they're both just constants. So this is 0.6x minus 2 when you combine the constants. So the expanded version only has 2 terms. Down here, this only has 2 terms. Actually, this one's a little funny because they're being multiplied, these 2 factors. So you can think of this as only having 1 term right now in this factored version because it's just one product. And so if I FOIL this out, I actually have to FOIL this one out. So 3x times 4 is 3x squared. 3x times negative 1 is negative 3x. Plus 4x. And then 4 times negative 1 is negative 4. And so you can combine like terms in the middle here, the x's. So we have 3x squared plus 1x, or just, you can leave it just x honestly, and then minus 1. So there's 3 terms here after we expand. And then the last one, we have 1 term again because this is all getting multiplied. And then if we expand it, 3x to the 4th y times x squared. All that you're going to combine here is the x's. So you have x to the 4th times x to the 2nd, and so that's a total of 6 x's. So x to the 6th, and then the y that was already there. And then 3 times negative 4 is negative 12, and you had x to the 4th and y. Okay, so there's 2 terms here. Alright, so multiplying those out. Now, in the next part, we're going to write the greatest common factor. We worked on this in on page 5. Write the GCF of each term in the second column, and then write the factored polynomial in the third. So we're starting to factor. We haven't actually factored yet. This was just kind of getting us ready for it. So the GCF, what do these 2 terms have in common? And we worked on this again in the last video. The 4x squared and the 16, these share a 4. So if I factor out a 4, you're going to factor out the GCF. If I factor out a 4, well, from this term, think of dividing it. If I were to divide the first term by 4, I'm left with x squared. If I were to divide the second term by 4, I have positive 4. And that's our factored version of our polynomial. Next one. These two terms, what do they have in common? Well, for coefficients, they share a 5. So the GCF so far has a 5 in it. Both terms have x's in them. This one has 5 x's, this one has 3. So they both share at least 3. They share 3 x's. Okay? And then they don't both have y's, so that is the GCF. So we factor out this GCF. And remember, think of it like dividing by it. If I divide 5 by 5, I get 1. X cubed, I'm dividing that in here. So x to the 5th divided by x cubed. Or I'm taking out 3 of the x's from 5 of them. So there's 2 left. And then the y squared was there. And then the second term, it has a minus sign. So think of it as dividing. If I were to divide negative 15 by 5, I get 3, negative 3 here. And then I'm dividing out x to the 3rd by x to the 3rd. Or I'm taking out the x to the 3rd, all of it. And so there's really 1 left. And I'm going to make this look better, but there's really a times 1 left because we took all of those x's. And so just to make this look slightly better, 5x cubed times, we tend to leave the 1 as a coefficient off. We just tend to not write that. So 5x cubed times x squared y squared minus 3. Alright, keep going. This time we have 4 terms. If you look at all of them, they do not all have an x. So I can't factor out an x. But they all do have a coefficient in common. They all have a number in common. It happens to be the number 7. So we're going to factor out 7. The first term, 14 divided by 7 is 2, and we have x cubed. The second term, factor out the 7 or think of dividing by it. You're left with 1x squared. I'm just going to write it as x squared. Second term, third term, divide by 7, and you're left with negative 1, but there was still an x, so negative x. And then the last term, divide by 7, you're left with positive 6. And there it is. Okay, the next two are kind of interesting. There's 2 terms here. X squared times x plus 1 is 1 term, and then x plus 1 is the second term. So the question is, what do these 2 terms have in common? And if you think about it, the minus sign is separating the terms. The 2 terms have an x plus 1 in common. So that's my GCF. And if I factor that out, x plus 1, well, what's left? I took out the x plus 1 from this first term. So let me write it down here so you can see what I'm talking about. I had x squared times x plus 1 in this term, term number 1. I'm taking this out, I'm factoring this out, so what's left is an x squared. The next term looked like this. It looked like minus x plus 1. Well, if I take out the x plus 1, I still have my minus sign. It's not that there's nothing left. Whenever you take something out, you're really dividing by it. And so if I divide x plus 1 by itself, I'm left with 1. Alright, so that one's a little interesting. And if you're not sure you did it right, you can always distribute back in and check your work. This one does actually factor further. And we'll get into this in a few pages later in our book. But just so you're aware, and I'll just show you where it goes, this one does actually factor further. We'll get into this in more detail. It factors like this. Okay, and then the last one on page 7, these 2 terms, so there's 2 terms separated by this plus sign, they share, if you look in front, they don't share anything with the 5x squared or 3, but they both share this x minus 5 factor. So if I factor out x minus 5, what's left? And so I have this term here, this 1 term, I'm taking the x minus 5 out. I'm dividing by it, so I'm left with the 5x squared. The second term, I'm dividing out the x minus 5, so I'm left with the plus and a 3. And that's it. This is the factored version. And if you wanted to distribute this x minus 5 back in, you would see that you got right back to where we just came from. Alright, moving on to the next page, page 8. So now we're kind of building our way up to being able to factor a polynomial in 3 terms. So that's what's coming up eventually. But right now we're still working with 4 terms, okay? And what's going to happen in the near future, in another video, is we're going to have 3 terms. We're going to separate it into 4 terms, and then we're going to do the process I'm about to work with you with, showing. So we're building up to the main process of factoring a polynomial. Right now, you have 4 terms, 14x cubed plus 7x plus 8x, 7x squared plus 8x plus 4. And so the idea is, this is called factoring by grouping, because you group 2 of the terms. And so part of the work is already done for us on this first one. Notice the first 2 terms are grouped together from here, and the second 2 terms are grouped together. Be careful when you do this, and I'll show you in this example where it's blank, but don't put your parentheses on the outside of the plus sign. Like, don't put the plus sign inside the parenthesis, because they still have to be separated by a plus sign, these terms. And what you do is in each group, so you have 2 groups technically. This is group number 1, right here, this first group, and this is group number 2, and it's a group of terms. In group 1, you factor out the GCF. That's why we've been working on GCF in the page 7 and on the other video. So what do these 2 terms have in common? What is their GCF? Well, 14 and 7 share a 7, and x cubed and x squared share an x squared. Okay, and so if we factor that out, the work has already been done for us. Notice what's left, 2x plus 1. And let's just check why that's true. If you take out 7 from 14, you divide. So 14 divided by 7 is 2, and then x cubed divided by x squared is just a single x. And then 7x squared divided by itself is 1. And if you're ever not sure, you can distribute this back in. So 7x squared times 2x, and you'll get back where you started. And same thing here, 7x squared times 1. Next group, 8x and 4, what do they have in common? Well, 8 and 4 share a 4. And then they don't both have x's as far as the terms go. So that's all they share. 8x and 4 only share a 4. And so if we factor that out, we have 2 left and an x left, because 8 divided by 4 is 2, and there's still an x. And then 4 divided by 4 is 1. So we took out a 4 from 4. And remember, this is not nothing when you take out 4 from 4. It's really 4 divided by 4, so there's a 1 left. And then you factor one more time. So we technically just factored twice. We factored out the GCF here and here. And we're going to factor one more time. From here, I'm going to underline it. We have 2 terms from our factoring. So term 1 and term 2. So this is over here, then in the back, that's term 2. And the front here, this is term 1. And so from this term in the front and this term in the back, separated by the plus sign in the middle, what do these terms have in common? And this is what we were doing on the previous page, page 7. These terms share a 2x plus 1. So you factor that out. You say, I'm going to take the 2x plus 1, I'm going to factor it out. So 2x plus 1. And think of that as dividing. So if I divide the first term by 2x plus 1, if I take that out, you can even just cover it up. If you take that out, what's left is a 7x squared. Second term, if you factor out or divide out the 2x plus 1, what's left is 4. And so you put those together. 7x squared and positive 4. And then this is the factored polynomial. And so in the very first video, we were multiplying polynomials, but if you ever wanted to check, you can take this polynomial, 2x, and I'll just put it down here, 2x plus 1 times 7x squared plus 4, and you can FOIL that out or use the box method, and you'll get back to where we came from. You'll get back here. Now this is a different method, so this is another option for you. It's the area method. I won't do all of them with this example. I'll just I'll show this one at least with this method. So this method says that you should kind of work backwards from the box method for multiplying. So you take the terms of your polynomial, and the highest powered one goes in this first box, and then you just fill in the rest of your boxes. The constant goes in this last one, this last square. And then you ask yourself, well, what times what equals the contents of this little square? So to get a 14, the only options are 2 and 7 or 1 and 14. So if I have to kind of look ahead, I'm thinking, I'll write it down off to the side here. Okay, so I'm thinking 2 and 7 or 1 and 14. Well, I have to look forward. Okay, if I pick 1 and 14, well, I have to have a 7 here. So I have to multiply to get 7 here. So I have to pick the 2 and 7. And so if I put the 7 here and the 2 here, that's going to give me a 14 when I multiply, but I need a total of 3 x's, x cubed. And so notice I have, over here I have to have a 7x squared when I multiply. So 7x squared can go here, and 2x to the first power can go here, and when you multiply, you get 14x to the third power. Now how I knew that the x squared goes here and the x goes there, and not like maybe this box or this one, it's because the last box has to multiply to make 4, and so there's no x's in this column or this row. And then so now we can move it on to a next box. The only way to go 7x squared times something equals itself is if this is a positive 1. And then now we can fill in the last box by knowing that this should be a 4, so 1 times 4 is 4, and then we can check this last box here. 2x times 4 is 8x. And so notice that's our factors. 2x plus 1, 7x squared plus 4. So this is another way to do it. If this way makes more sense to you, feel free to do it this way. I'm going to be focusing on the factor by grouping method. So let's move on to the next one. There are 4 terms in this polynomial. We're going to group the first 2 and the last 2. So the first 2 are grouped together right here. This last 2 are grouped together. Notice the plus sign stays in the middle. So this time less work has been done ahead of time for us. We have to do more of the steps. So group number 1 here. So group number 1 right here. What do they have in common? The 2 terms. And it's already done for us, but let's just talk about it. 5 goes into 5 and 5 goes into negative 25. So they share a 5. X squared goes into x cubed as well as x squared. So they share an x squared. Now, if you divide out what you factored out, so if you divide out what you factored out, 5 divided by 5 is 1, x cubed divided by x squared is x. Next term, negative 25 divided by 5 is negative 5, and x squared divided by itself is 1. So I can put it times 1, I'm just going to leave it off. And so if you're not sure if this is confusing, double check. If you bring this 5x squared back in, I'll show it off on another paper real quick. If you bring this 5x squared back in, let me just write it, you can make sure that you got this right. So we have 5x cubed when we distribute, and negative 25x squared also, which is where we just came from. So that's a good way to check. Alright, next group 2. Group 2, the 2 terms, what did 3x and negative 15 have in common? Well, 3 goes into both of those. Okay, and that's all that they share. And so you divide by 3. You say, what's 3x divided by 3? It's x. What's negative 15 divided by 3? It's negative 5. And then you now remember what we just did up here. Now you factor one more time. So I'll kind of highlight it again. There's one term here, plus sign, one term here. So from these 2 terms that I underlined, what do they have in common? Well, they don't have the 5x squared and the 3 in common, but they do have this x minus 5 in common. So you factor out what they have in common, and if you think of it as dividing by that x minus 5 in this term, you're left with a 5x squared. And from this term, if you divide out the x minus 5, you're left with positive 3. And so this polynomial is the same thing as x minus 5 times 5x squared plus 3. And always you can FOIL it out to check your work to see if you got that correct. Moving on to the next one. Now this is the first time there's no steps for us, no guides, but I'm going to walk you through it. So what you do is you take your 4 terms and you're going to group the first two. So I'm going to group 10x cubed plus 5x squared. And I'm going to group the second two. Now notice this is the first one also where there's a minus sign instead of a plus sign. And so this is different. I have to have a plus sign in the middle of my groups. So plus, and then this is a negative 6x minus 3. Okay, so that's the very beginning. That's the very first thing we needed to do for this problem. Put groups for these 4 terms. Group 1 has the first 2 terms, group 2 has the second 2, but the middle needs to be a plus sign. Okay, now we factor out from the first group. What do these share? These 2 terms share a 5. 5 goes into 5 and 10. They also have an x squared in common. Okay, so we're going to take that out. Now what do you get when you factor out a 5x squared? Think of it like dividing. So 10 divided by 5 is 2. X cubed divided by x squared is a single x. 5x squared divided by itself is positive 1. Alright, next group. Okay, so this one's a little different. What do negative 6x and negative 3 have in common? They actually have a negative 3 in common. Negative 3 goes into negative 6 as well as itself. Okay, so now divide by negative 3. What's negative 6x divided by negative 3? It's positive 2x. And what's negative 3 divided by negative 3? It's positive 1. And then this is really good news. Whenever you see this factor repeated like this is what we've been doing for these examples. You have one term with this 2x plus 1 factor and another term with this 2x plus 1 factor. And so you factor that out. You factor one more time. You factored out the GCF here and here. Now you factor out this common factor of 2x plus 1. And then what's left, when you take out the 2x plus 1, you took this out, you divided by it. What's left is the 5x squared. And over here, you took out the 2x plus 1, you divided by it, so what's left is a negative 3. And that is this polynomial factored. Alright, let's keep going. 2 more for us. So we have x cubed minus x squared in our first group. And then remember, you want a plus sign in the middle. And so the second group is going to get the other 2 terms. Put that minus sign in there with it though. Minus 2x plus 2. Okay, let's see what we can come up with. Group 1. This group, what do these terms have in common? The coefficient is 1, so we don't have to worry about that. But these 2 terms share an x squared. So if we factor out an x squared from x cubed, if you divide by it, you're left with a single x. If you factor out an x squared from itself, it's 1, but there was a minus sign, so negative 1. Next group, what do negative 2x and positive 2 have in common? They actually have a negative 2 in common, and here's why I'm going to factor out the negative 2 instead of the positive 2. Watch what happens. If we factor out the negative 2, if you divide negative 2x by negative 2, you get positive 1x. And if you divide 2 by negative 2, you get negative 1. Okay, here's why I just did it that way. Look at our common factor now. It is the same, it matched. So this brings a good point that I want to mention to you guys. Anytime you have a negative term like this in the second group like this, you're always going to end up factoring out that negative. This last one, it was pretty clear because both terms were negative, so we took out the negative with them. But this one was a little different because it wasn't so clear. And 2 goes into negative 2 and 2, but negative 2 also goes into these 2 terms. So anytime this term in the second group, this leading term in the second group has a negative, go ahead and factor that out. And if you forget, you'll see that it just won't work, and I'll show you really fast why. So let's say I didn't realize that. So my second group, let me write down what we had already. X squared times x minus 1. My second group, let's say I just took out the positive 2. So I'd have my plus 2. So I'm actually pretending I didn't do what I did already. So I took out the positive 2. So negative 2x divided by positive 2 is negative x. 2 divided by 2 is positive 1. And now if I look at my two terms, they don't have the same factor. This factor here doesn't match this factor. And what's been happening is these factors have been matching, and so I've been taking them out. I've been factoring them out. Okay, so now these two terms, they do share a common factor of negative 1. So you're going to take out a negative 1, x minus 1, excuse me. And then if you take out x minus 1, what's left in the first term is x squared. And what's left in the second term is minus 2. And this is your polynomial factored. Alright, if you tried the last one, you might have got stuck, and here's why. So this one, nothing could actually go any further as far as factoring out again. So the first two terms shared a y, I took that out. I was left with y squared plus 4x. The second two terms shared a 2 and a z, so if I factored that out, I was left with a 4x and a 1. So because this was a y and this one had a 1, they aren't the same factor, so we couldn't actually go any further on this one. So unfortunately, this one was as good as it gets. There was nothing more to do, so we had nothing to show there. Alright, that's it.